We are super happy and excited and pleased to have Helen, Glaze, and Angelique Russell with us this morning. This is a topic that I personally am very interested in because the information right now about COVID is so complicated, and we as a family here have so many questions about what the right thing to do is right now, and it can be really hard to make those decisions. And so Angelique and Helen are here to help us navigate that. Angelique has a Master's of Public Health. She's a senior consultative analysis on the clinical analytics team at Providence, which is a 51 hospital healthcare system in Seattle, headquartered there. And she works directly with their COVID-19 cohort data to support outbreak readiness and outcome analysis. And so she is a resident here of Claremont, has her master's degree in public health from UC Berkeley, and she posts a lot on Facebook, and so I like reading her posts. It kind of helps me make sense of what's going on. So she's going to talk a little bit about the public health side of things, and then Helen is here to help us navigate, once we have a little bit of the data and we're trying to answer these questions, how do we talk about that with people in our quarantine circle, with friends and family? So Helen is a licensed marriage and family therapist with the Claremont Counseling and Support Center. She has worked in conflict mitigation and international community development around the world. So I think that's going to be really helpful in this conversation. She's trained in the Gottman marital therapy, works with couples to help with their communication skills, and also has experience in helping people kind of define their spiritual and ethical foundations. Again, something that I think will be helpful. So let's do a little Zoom applause for them, and I'll turn it over to Helen and Angelique.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jacob. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share with my community. We've broken down our presentation into two parts. I'm going to start by overviewing some facts about the pandemic and also kind of hopefully give some perspective into how epidemiologists consider different facts that may seem like they're competing and grade evidence, because we really think that having facts is so important to our decision making, and that will segue into Helen's presentation, where she's going to present some actual tools for hands-on decision making. So I'm going to start with a little story. This is from one of my favorite books by Jim Collins. It's a business book called From Good to Great, and it's the story of James Stockdale, who was the highest ranking officer at the Hanoi Hilton, who was a prisoner of war for 8 years and helped a lot of other prisoners, wrote a book with his wife about his experience. And Jim Collins, in his interview with him, asked him, you survived this prisoner of war experience, but can you tell me who didn't survive? Because a lot of prisoners of war, unfortunately, didn't survive. And he says, oh, that's easy. The optimists. The optimists, I don't understand. The optimists, oh, they were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come and Christmas would go. And then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving, and then by Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart. And this is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. And I feel like, especially having come out of shelter-in-place orders, we're all feeling a little imprisoned by this pandemic right now. And I can very much relate to this statement here, because of course, faith is really important, but just optimism or blind faith and not considering the facts is dangerous and definitely isn't going to help us not just survive the pandemic, but thrive through it and make good decisions. So that's in the book, The Stockdale Paradox. You must retain faith that you will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties, which I'm pretty confident about when it comes to COVID-19. We will eventually return to what we consider a normal society, but at the same time, we must confront the brutal facts of the current reality, whatever they might be. Also included a Bible quote that I thought really related to this, which is Corinthians 1:16-13, be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous and be strong. And I think really that's what we all need to make decisions and thrive in this pandemic. So I'm going to start by just reviewing the kind of choices that epidemiologists are making right now. I think when I start talking to a lot of people, or perhaps I become friends with someone and they see on my Facebook the kinds of things that I'm doing with my family, I think there's some kind of assumption that if you're in the data and really familiar with the epidemic, you know how serious it is, you're staying home all the time and taking maximum precautions. But that's not necessarily the case. Epidemiologists are skilled at weighing the evidence and assessing the risk of different activities and in light of that evidence. And that does lead to some decisions to go out of the house and do things. So this was a New York Times survey. It was 511 epidemiologists, and they just did it in June. So of course, if they were to repeat the survey today, or they were to do it in a few months from now, it might be very different. But they asked epidemiologists what they would do this summer. These were the items that they would do this summer. They include vacation overnight within driving distance. I have done that personally. See a doctor for a non-urgent appointment, bring in mail without precautions, and get a haircut at a salon or barbershop. I will not do that. So that's the consensus decision there. And you can see some of them are very close. Then when we get to 3 to 12 months, a lot of activities that I see happening very commonly are on here, including small dinner parties, hike or picnic outdoors, sending kids to school, work in a shared office, play dates, going on the bus, visiting elderly relatives, traveling by plane and eating at a dine-in restaurant, and going to the gym. When I say this 3 to 12 months, the way I think of this in my mind as when the pandemic is under control. So optimistically, we would have a low case count and limited community spread 3 to 12 months from now at some point in time. Here in LA, we are not at that point in time right now. We have rising case counts every day and rising mortalities. I will say that some of the recent data shows that leveling off, if you're worried about that. But it still remains true that we have widespread, unmitigated community spread. And these are many things that epidemiologists would not do in the context of that. But you can also see there's a great deal of disagreement, even among people who have expertise in this area and presumably are reading all the evidence. There isn't much of a consensus. The largest consensus item on here is eat at a dine-in restaurant, with 56% saying 3 to 12 months from now. But that's barely more than half. And the reason why I point that out is I want you to understand that even among the experts, people are just making the best decision they can with the evidence we have, which is often very poor evidence, very low-grade evidence. And it can be especially difficult to weigh low-grade evidence when there's uncertainty and conflicting statements in scientific literature as well as the media. And that definitely influences even the experts. And finally, here are the often to the future, definitely not till the pandemic is over items, which include attend a wedding or a funeral, hug or shake hands when greeting a friend, go out with someone you don't know well, attend a church or a religious service, which we can all do on Zoom and Facebook Live, but they meet in person, stop routinely wearing a face covering. That one may be surprising to some people in terms of how much longer epidemiologists believe we'll be doing that, and attend a sporting event, concert, or play. So these are definitely all high crowd, dense activities that epidemiologists are not doing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how medical experts and, to a lesser extent, epidemiologists arrive at decisions like this, and what it means to review evidence. And this is a little confusing, and I'll walk through this whole graph, but let me just explain first. In medicine, which is primarily where I work in healthcare. I have 10 years of experience working in healthcare. There is often very little agreement about what the treatment should be for a given disease. And I'm sure that you've experienced this as a patient when you've found that something you had a procedure or operation for is the same medical condition that a friend or family member had, and they didn't have that procedure or operation. Your doctor favors medications, and you're talking to your friend and you hear they're on different medications, and you wonder, how do they arrive at such different decisions? Early in medicine, maybe 30 to 50 years ago, it was just each individual doctor's best guess at what should be done. And over many decades, a process has been evolving to move medicine into being more evidence-based. And in order to do that, we need ways to rank evidence. Now, I know everyone on here isn't a medical doctor or an epidemiologist, but I really do think anyone can rank evidence this way. And it's so helpful when you're trying to talk to a loved one or a family member and they're saying, well, I heard this in a newspaper article yesterday, and so that must be true. And you're thinking, oh, I read a study on that last week and it can't be true. And then it just feels like at some points, facts transform into opinions and you just agree to disagree. And to me, that's a bit unfortunate because there is an opportunity to rank that information and reach a consensus that's based on the evidence instead of just saying, well, I guess you read that, so you're going to believe that, and I'm going to believe this and go on. Alexa, stop. Sorry about that. Someone's Alexaing into my room. So on the left here in the blue columns, this is how we grade the evidence. So A, B, and C grade, with A being consistent evidence from well-performed, high-quality studies or systemic reviews that are free of systemic issues like bias. And high-level evidence for COVID-19 generally only consists when we're talking about things that aren't specific to COVID-19, like mask wearing. SARS is often used, research that was done on SARS, which is a different coronavirus, and MERS research is used for COVID-19. But of course, in the context of COVID-19, we have very little grade A evidence, including on treatments, etc. Very little. So we tend to have to rely on B, which is moderate or low level of evidence. So these may be studies that have important limitations, such as observational studies that are not randomized routine clinical trials. And finally, C, which is very low level of evidence. And this is evidence with studies with serious flaws, and it includes expert opinion. And I really want to emphasize that because many headlines that have served as flashpoints and really got a lot of attention and then set people in opposition to each other were simply just experts coming out and stating something to be true. That's not normally considered a high grade of evidence, and only it is rarely a recommendation from experts comes out of those expert opinions. And when it becomes a recommendation has to do with the classification. So I just went over the blue line on the left. Those are the grades. And then the rainbow, green, yellow, orange, red on the right, this is how we classify recommendations based on what we call their strength. So we're going to make a strong recommendation. Well, even with really low evidence, we might make a strong recommendation because the benefits are so much greater than the risks. So early in the pandemic, this is where the mask recommendation came out of. Initially, it was fairly weak on the evidence. There's a lot of conflicting evidence in the literature about masks, but it's so easy to do and the risk and burden is really low. So it made its way into public health and eventually CDC recommendations. Later, a systemic review came out of multiple studies done on masks. That's where they take data from, it was a meta-analysis. So they take data across several studies, they aggregated it together, and they tried to answer the question, do masks limit respiratory disease transmission? And the answer was yes, yes they do. So that recommendation became a strong recommendation based on grade A evidence. And then finally, as we get into moderate, weak, and do not do, those are all just based on the balance of benefit and harm, which when you think about COVID-19 in our individual way, we think about benefit and harm, can be very difficult to make these recommendations. So I went over, I added here some sample evidence grading and classification of common questions. So people message me, text message me on Facebook, call me on the phone. We have meetings about this at work all the time. with common questions. And I gave some of my sample gradings. These are my opinion, as well as evidence classification based on the evidence classifications. So the first one is, do masks halt the spread of respiratory viruses? Yes, we have meta-analysis on this now, so it's grade A evidence. And because it's so easy to do, it's a strong recommendation. Can wearing a mask be harmful when exercising? Not likely. Observational studies show that oxygen saturations may remain high when you're wearing a mask, even when exercising. It's a moderate recommendation because if it were harmful, it could create a great deal of harm. So you have to weigh the risks against that. Should I avoid indoor dining and indoor socialization? Yes, we only have grade B evidence on this. They've done contact tracing studies, which are observational, and there is a great deal of expert opinion out there about the risk of indoor spread. And especially when there's poor ventilation and HVAC. And is it dangerous to go to an emergency department if I'm sick? No, we've done a lot of work on this at Providence to track our populations coming in and out of the ED and make sure that they're not vectors for disease. And our limited data shows that it's not a common setting of exposure. We also have limited data that shows people who are arriving at the hospital are sicker than they usually are outside of our pandemic conditions. There's a great deal of concern that people aren't going to the hospital soon enough. When you think you may be having a medical emergency, I'd strongly recommend that everyone not delay their care. Is COVID-19 airborne? This is a really hard one. You might think we might have more evidence than this, but we actually only have grade C. There's limited data, and expert opinion supports probable airborne transmission via aerosol. That wasn't the case for SARS virus. The original SARS is what we have most of our research on. We have not proven it conclusively that it is airborne. And it's a moderate recommendation because it's very difficult to implement airborne precautions. It's costly, and we don't necessarily have all the supply to do it. So you can see some of these get very complicated. Is COVID-19 as deadly as the flu? Nope. A lot more people are dying this year than a normal flu year, for sure. Is asymptomatic transmission real? Yes, only grade B though. We have contact tracing and some limited meta-analysis based on observational studies, including laboratory findings that suggests asymptomatic spread is real. And can children be asymptomatic transmitters? We have a good deal of grade B evidence on this. While contact tracing shows children are uncommon transmitters, which most of those studies were done during shelter-in-place orders, that's really based a lot on behavior. Like if your kids are staying home, they're not going to give you coronavirus. The strong evidence exists that children can shed as much virus as adults, and children are known vectors of other respiratory illnesses. So most experts agree that they're definitely a source of asymptomatic transmission. So I wanted to show some headlines just to make you think about how much of this you would count as evidence and how you would grade it. So this first one is one I love. This is from back in early March. A California scientist warns people to stay away from beaches during COVID-19 pandemic. And one of her quotes was that the ocean water is sneezing COVID-19 on people. Not a lot of other experts came out to support that opinion, which I hope everyone immediately thought is grade C. Hydroxychloroquine fails to prevent COVID-19, large study finds. And if you look in the subtitle here, it says the findings come from a highly anticipated clinical trial. This was a trial that would be included in the set of grade A evidence. Normally by the time we're saying it's grade A evidence, we need more than one trial, but certainly this has the potential to be better than grade B evidence. And then here's a competing headline. Study finds hydroxychloroquine may have boosted survival, but other researchers have doubts. So in this newspaper article, this study is not a candidate for any higher than grade B at best. Other experts have already found methodological flaws in it. In the case of this headline, the researchers didn't separate out patients who had received corticosteroids like dexamethasone, which later prove to be protective and could explain the entire benefit seen in their hydroxychloroquine cohort. Bakersfield doctors dispute need for stay-at-home order. Again, barely rises to grade C in terms of evidence. And sure, you might consider urgent care doctors to be experts in many areas, but we have to weigh that against the other evidence that we have when we establish its truthfulness. So I hope that's somewhat helpful to think about how to classify evidence in your own mind. When Helen gets to her decision-making tool, a great deal about that tool is about, you know, how to rank what you believe against what your values are. And hopefully when you're ranking what you're believing, you're doing your best to be a citizen scientist about it, and making sure that we're not just doing things that even scientists are vulnerable to, such as finding facts and studies and expert opinions that support the things that we already believe, and ignoring high-grade evidence that is coming out of meta-analysis and routine clinical trials, because then it would require us to change our minds. Even experts make those types of decisions, but really what we want to do in this pandemic is all be using the best evidence that we have, and making sure that that best evidence isn't just the evidence that we want to see, but the evidence that can guide a healthy decision. And what if there's no evidence or recommendations are vague? Unfortunately, this is the case with a lot of what we have, especially coming out of public health. And one thing that's especially difficult is our public health departments have been less clear on when we can socialize with people that we love. And I feel like humans have a natural tendency to feel safe around our loved ones, our friends, and our family, and to feel unsafe around strangers. And in light of that classification, we tend to think of things that involve strangers as being more dangerous than things that involve our loved ones. But from an evidence standpoint, we see so much transmission happening indoors in settings like a family home, where extended family and friends are gathered to be together. And when those extended friends and family include risks happening in the community, such as essential workers and people who may be less mask compliant, or people who are going to the gym and taking risks individually, those individual risks become a collective risk when those individuals are in an indoor setting, socializing with other people. So again, these decisions are really hard to make, and I think Helen's tool is going to be very helpful. But definitely keep in mind that even epidemiologists can't agree on many of these decisions. So the process of weighing the evidence can be really helpful with a framework for decision making. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Helen. And Helen, I'll keep sharing the slides, and you just tell me when to progress forward with it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Angelique. I'm going to kind of get to the facts and how to maybe have those discussions in a minute. But that was such an important foundation. I learned a lot, even though we talked the other day. I feel like I got such a better handle on how to grade evidence and facts that I'm looking at. I want to start by talking a little bit about just sort of the psychological experience that we're having, many of us. At the beginning of the pandemic and the shelter at home orders, I saw a lot of memes on Facebook saying some things like, your grandparents were called to war and you're being asked to sit on the couch. You know, it shouldn't be that hard. And I even probably posted it a couple of times, but as time has gone on, and I myself have felt the effects of what that is. I would never, I've had some thoughts that I wanted to share with you. You know, I'd never say that sitting on the couch is harder than going to war. That would be ridiculous. But I do think that if we look at some of the predictors of PTSD and trauma response, we could see that psychologically being asked to sit on the couch has some real challenges. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we give ourselves grace, and that we can validate our own feelings around that. There's a slew of research on what causes people who experience a similar event, a traumatic event like a car accident or abuse, why some people have trauma symptoms after an event like that and others don't. And there's a few predictors that we can point to. The last two, especially, that I'll give you, I think, being applicable here. First is that the biggest predictor is whether or not you've experienced trauma before, right? So if we're someone who's had trauma in our history, experiencing trauma again can lead to a higher probability that you will have a trauma response. Second is, what were other people's response to us in and during and after the trauma event? Were we listened to? Were we blamed? Were we believed? Did we have a sense that someone was going to protect us? If yes, then there's less PTSD. If we were blamed, or if we felt unlistened to, or if we felt like the people who could have the power to weren't going to protect us, then there's more trauma response. Three, what did we do, or what were we able to do? Did we have a sense that we could take action to resolve or even avenge the traumatic event? Did we experience that agency? So if we were in a car accident, could we wiggle out of the seatbelt, get ourselves out of the car, maybe even get someone else out of the car? Could I do anything, or was I stuck in that seatbelt and just at the mercy of the events? If we feel stuck and at the mercy of things, we're more likely to experience a traumatic event. And so as we're asked to be home and to shelter in place and to be more careful, I think some people experience that as a stuck powerlessness experience. And there's varying degrees to which we feel that we can trust the people who are charged to protect us. And so that is a compounding factor. So I think, if we're feeling like a sense of, this shouldn't be so hard for myself or for someone else, we really need to check that. This is a hard thing that we're doing. And I think we need to validate that. So it's in this environment where we may be experiencing sort of that simultaneous reaction trauma of having a foggy brain while being hyper alert, that we're asked to make these really complex decisions every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do ourselves in our own minds. And it's really hard to do it with someone else, particularly if they're not agreeing with us on what we should do. So I have put together kind of an easy worksheet for you all. And I think, Angelique, you can move the slide. I can't remember what order everything's in. I'll get there in a second. So there's a worksheet that I put together. Jacob, maybe after some way we can forward that to folks to help you take a little bit of the fogginess out of the equation and kind of write down or discuss the specifics of what you're struggling with and making a particular decision. In my work with my clients and in just my own experience being a human in this moment, I've seen sort of three areas where people are getting stuck and feeling kind of overwhelmed. The first is just the feelings, kind of what I talked about before. There's a lot of intense, difficult, and conflicting feelings that we're having. And so it can just be hard to think. We might be tempted to stick to our binary, this is good, this is bad, or maybe not evolve our opinions on things because it's just so scary. Second is, I think what Angelique covered so well, is confusion or disagreement about what the facts are. That how can we even make a decision if the facts are conflicting or we don't know what to believe? And third is more of an existential issue, which is what happens when we have a conflict between two or more deeply held ethical beliefs, where I, on a decision about whether to send my kid to school, the things that make that important to either do or not do are equally powerful to us. And so we're kind of stuck there. So go ahead, Angelique. And so this is the kind of first half of the first page of that worksheet that I'll have sent out to you guys. This tool is really intended not to maybe solve all of the questions about coronavirus that you may have or solve disagreements about major philosophies, but really getting down to a tangible, specific question that you're struggling with. Should I do this or should I do that? So the very first part of that process is decide on what decision you're trying to make and be clear and specific about it. You know, does Johnny go to baseball practice on Thursday? Right? That specific. The next step is that number one there. What are all the feelings I am or we are having about making this decision? This is a really interesting and difficult thing to do. It's a difficult thing to do to talk with someone about it. And go ahead, Angelique, and move to the next slide. A lot of the decision or the feelings I'm hearing people struggle with are sadness, feeling trapped, angry, scared. And oftentimes when we're trying to make a decision with someone else that we're struggling with, there's a lot of resentment and frustration about how someone else has been, that we're trying to make the decision with, has been behaving. So go ahead and switch next. The first thing that we can do when we're having those discussions is just check in with each other about how are you feeling? I know I disagree with you on, you know, masks and whether or not social environment is more than physical safety. And we've had all these fights about it. How are you doing as a person? At the beginning of our staff meetings at work, we often start with, how are you doing as a person today? And we go around the room, or in this case, the Zoom, and we check in. And it's a wonderful time to be seen, to be heard, to see others, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what we're fighting about office policy. It's a way to connect. And if any of you have been to my couples workshops, I think this is a really good time to do what we have talked about there, which is to take turns being the speaker and to take turns being the listener, so that you're not reacting to the feelings that someone else is having, or you're not trying to change the feelings that someone else is having. You're just hearing it. You're getting in touch with yourself. You're naming the cocktail of emotions that you're having. You're giving yourself permission to feel all of it. And if you're making that decision and someone else has thoughts and feelings that you need to hear, you're taking a deep breath and you're giving them permission to feel what they're feeling as well. And I like the concept of grace and how important it is to give grace at this stage in the process. And I like this verse quite a bit from Romans 11:6, where it says, and if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. Meaning the works, the actions that someone else may have been taking may just feel awful to you. But in this moment, we just want to offer kind of unconditional positive regard, as we say in the therapy world, to know that that person is struggling just like you're struggling. I have a working definition of grace that helps me in my own personal life, and I try to give to clients, which is grace is offering someone a favor even when in that moment you're absolutely sure they don't deserve it. Because it may be that in 3 hours you get, okay, they deserved it just as I deserve it at times. Go ahead and next. So now we're on to stage 2. You've talked about your feelings. Now let's get to the facts. Angelique did a great job of talking about how to grade facts. I want to say just a few things about when you're having that conversation with either yourself, different parts of yourself, or with someone else, that I think is important to do to sort of go through this systematically. First is when you've identified an issue to be decided upon, clearly define which facts you're basing that decision on. List them. And then on the right, you'll see percentages. And that's the degree to which you are confident in that fact or in that hypothesis that you're basing your decision on. And if you're navigating this with another person, I think it can be very useful for you to line up, what percentage do I believe this? And what percentage do you believe this? And if they're wildly different, have that discussion. And the third thing is, if you're wildly different, you have that discussion and you're still not getting anywhere, research that fact together or assign it to someone, and then come back to the table afterwards to say, okay, I've got these 3 articles on can children transmit the virus to adults. Let's look at them. And here's what these articles say. And now with Angelique's tool, we can say, okay, this is grade A evidence, and it's a strong recommendation, so maybe this is where we need to go with that. We're living in a world of working hypotheses. With changing economic, psychological realities, scientific realities, and we are tasked with imperfect decision making. So, you know, it's not that we are going to, as I like this quote by Albert Einstein, education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. We're not probably going to be able to count on too many facts remaining entirely stable. So what we can do is develop a way to think about it together and do our best to follow a process that is consistent and gracious. If we give a percentage belief ranking, I think that can help us avoid some of the binary thinking that we do of all or nothing and help us get to a point of, you know, there may be a 10% chance that you're right here, but 90% of me just can't go with that. So can we try something else? So go ahead, Angelique. Ethical dissonance hurts. So if what we're finding is that we do all the fact stuff and we're still stuck, we might have clarity on what we believe is true, but we don't know what to do yet. Many of the folks that I've spoken with, and certainly this has been my experience most days of the week, I could feel paralyzed because I'm torn between competing deeply held ethics. So a definition of ethical dissonance is the inconsistency between our aspiration to uphold a moral self-image and our participation in perceived unethical behavior. We experience these events as moral violations, a sense that we have violated our moral codes. When our ethics are in direct conflict, we experience moral violation no matter which choice you make. And this can leave us feeling really stuck. It's really, really difficult. And so the question is what to do about that. I think the first thing to do about that is to know that we're in it, to know that whichever decision we make, we are going to feel the discomfort of potentially having some moral violation, and that's okay, that we can live with that we have to do our best to define those ethics and rank them and make a decision consciously about which one we're going to choose to live by. And Angelique can go forward for my last slide. And so on the worksheet that I've put together, I ask you to ask, what ethics are we trying to follow in making this decision? One example of an ethical conflict might be, I should be with family at important milestones, at weddings, at funerals, at birthdays, versus I need to be doing our part or my part to flatten the curve. Those can be equally powerful. I must ensure my child has positive social interactions. I am the guardian of my child's mental health. versus I've got to keep my family physically safe. And then the last question, can I or can we follow all of our ethics in making a yes or no decision, or am I going to have to prioritize one or the other? So I will end there. And I think we're at the point where we can invite some discussion.
All right, that was incredible. Thank you, Angelique and Helen. These were really helpful tools. I love the graph of how to rate evidence, and this, everyone in the comments, I put the link to this decision-making tool to use with people in your life. If you're watching this later on YouTube, then it's going to be in the description of the video. I'm sure a lot of you have questions, so go ahead. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask it. If you want to raise your hand, I can call on you. Otherwise, just unmute and go ahead and ask. Natalie, I see your hand up first here.
So my brother called me Tuesday to tell me that he proposed to his girlfriend and they're going to get married next Saturday. And they're in Texas, they're in Dallas. And so the prompt about should we drive across the country to see grandchildren really struck with me. I ended up making the decision that I'm not going to go. But my parents are, and so now there is a lot of resentment from my parents, a lot of anger, a lot of disappointment. My brother's okay with it. My brother understands. So that's, that's okay. But because my parents are one of my main emotional supporters, and I am kind of dependent on them, I really don't know how to navigate this. I don't know how to explain why I'm okay to go once a week and shop for seniors, but I'm not okay to drive cross country and spend a week in close contact with my family, especially considering my niece and nephew's mother, this is a second marriage for my brother, has not been quarantining the kids. She's been taking them to play dates and water parks and activities. So any advice on how to navigate something like this?
Angelique, should I start?
Yeah, why don't you start? I could certainly provide facts that support your decision, but I think that really relates to the ethical dissonance that you were describing earlier, Helen.
Yeah, I think the first thing is it may be difficult for your folks to be ready to have that conversation with you, and that there may just need to be some grieving about that. I mean, it's sad. I'm sad for you. And to recognize as best as you can that we are all doing our best to deal with this trauma, including you and including them, and you're coming out with very different outcomes of what that means. And to invite them that if they are ready to hear what you've based your decision on, that you would really love to share that with them, and that you love them and you hope that they are safe, and that everything turns out fine, but you're concerned for them. We can't control each other's behavior, and we are going to have to do a lot of grieving about the fact that we are going to come up with very different responses from people we know and people we need, and self-soothing and grieving about that.
Yeah, I agree. And I also feel a decision like that is especially wise because Texas and Los Angeles area are both having pretty significant outbreaks. And when we're considering travel to Arizona or Texas or another area with an outbreak, we have to consider the possibility that the virus may have mutated in one or both of our regions, and that we're spreading, if we were to take the virus with us, not just the COVID-19 that's spreading in our community, but a more virulent COVID-19 to another area. So even though there are no restrictions on travel right now, and earlier I admitted that I myself am traveling, I meant locally in California, and really going out of state to another region that has a widespread outbreak, it would be very unsafe right now. Especially if once you arrive, you're going to be pressured into activities that you're not comfortable with, such as indoor socialization or socializing with your niece and nephew who have not been socially isolating. So yeah, I echo Helen's sentiment that I'm sad you're in that situation, and hope your parents come to understand your perspective.
And yet it seems like a very wise decision on your part.
Another question? You can go ahead and unmute and jump in if you have one.
I read an article in the New Yorker, and I think this has to do with what you all are talking about. Came in a couple of minutes late, but that people deal with facts either on an emotional level or like a data type level. And I've been an RN, I've been a teacher, and my biggest conflicts have been with people going, well, it's just not true, and they lied to us in the beginning and they're lying now. And I'm like, look at the charts, look at, you know, the amount of people being tested, look at death rates, look at who's being quarantined, and make your decision from that. It sounds like the previous question is more the parents are being emotional, like, of course we should all be together for this, you know, this wonderful event, but we can't be. And, you know, I'm in the same situation. My brother and I, he's in Florida, I'm here, my mother's in New York. Even when and if she dies, which could be, she's gonna be 91, she's not in great health, we would be quarantined for 2 weeks. There's no way we can go. Even though emotionally you would want to go, I'm in the, you know, the data part of it going, it can't happen. And I do like, you know, evaluating the facts. Because, you know, I heard something, what they say, oh, because people keep getting tested over and over, that makes more positive tests. And I thought about it, I went, no, it doesn't, because they only report it when the test is positive. But again, there's my numerical background and nursing background looking at it from that angle versus the emotional angle. So I don't know.
Well, there's a good question there, Ellen. How do you have a conversation between two people if one person's data driven and one person might be feeling driven?
Exactly.
The way they make their decisions.
I think that's challenging. I would probably pull a therapist Jedi mind trick and just reflect the feeling that I'm seeing. So if I'm talking with someone and they're saying, no, it's not, that sounds crazy, and I might say something like, wow, it seems like this is really hard for you, and it sounds like this makes you feel really, this COVID is making you really angry, period. Just reflecting the feeling that I'm seeing, because I'm not going to convince them of different facts, right? But I can say, gosh, you look pissed when you talk about this.
You won't be able to see. Bill Dodge here for a question.
Go ahead.
Am I unmuted? Okay, I'm sure I'm unmuted. This is taking a slightly different tack, but I've heard people make the point that the greatest threat to public safety aren't the people who consciously violate what are considered to be the safe practices, like wearing masks, but the people who are constantly taking what they consider to be small risks that just are slightly a modification of their current behavior. You know, maybe concluding, for example, well, I did go away for overnight to do this. Now I feel fairly safe about going away for 3 nights to do this. Is there any truth to that sense that the biggest threat to safe behavior is not from people who consciously violate it, but from people who are constantly adding a little bit to their risk level.
I'm going to grade that comment C. It sounds like a really great expert opinion, but I haven't seen any evidence related to that. I'm trying to think about different contract tracing studies I've read and how it relates to that framework. Certainly there are many very small and slight decisions that have led to outbreaks. One that I'm thinking of in particular is an outbreak among teachers in Arizona who are sharing a classroom together, just 3 teachers sharing a classroom together. And it sounds like patient 0 may have either been a community exposure or a travel exposure during camping. It's not known who the patient 0 is, but the initial spread happened between a 10-minute conversation. So these are socially distanced individuals. Their students are home. They're doing distance learning, and they're just sharing a work environment, and they're not even sharing it at the same time in the same space. They're distanced apart. But on one given day, they spent 10 minutes chatting together at the end of the day, like you just might with colleagues sometimes. And it looks like that 10-minute chat may have been what eventually spread it to all 3 teachers. And unfortunately, one of the teachers lost her life. And I do think that it does remain important to be vigilant, and it's really hard. It's anxiety provoking, it's scary. And one of the feeling arguments that I hear a lot in my own family is who wants to go through their entire day so terrified? I don't think I do go through my entire day terrified or anxious or scared, but I do try to maintain vigilance because very small decisions can unfortunately result in exposure, and that's definitely true.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for at least one more question, and David Mann, you have your hand up.
Yes, I just want to say Penelope and I are here this morning enjoying this whole forum, and to thank Helen and Angelique for an incredibly practical, useful tool. I mean, we feel like we've instinctively been trying to do about half of this, but this goes a lot better. They're so practical. We live at Pilgrim Place, and we're in the upper half of our 70s, retired elders, and we've been needing to break out in the end of July or August, and have been trying to figure out a plan and then come back and experience quarantine at the end of a trip away. And we had made plans before the surge hit to go down and we have 2 sets of grandchildren and 2 families in the San Diego region, to spend some days visiting family with in an isolated bedroom in a big house. But still social gatherings. And one of those families has been bubbling with a huge extended family with a very large extended family with our in-laws for the last month. And they've traveled to Yosemite and Lake Tahoe for vacations. They really want to see the grandparents and have us. And then we were going to go from there up to a 10-day reservation at a very secluded cabin in the southern Sierras in a little tiny village, and do hiking together and just seclude ourselves in the beauty of the mountain woods. So we're using this process to decide not to visit family at this point, and to go to the secluded cabin, which feels, based on the evidence, pretty safe. But it's painful emotionally. It's very, very sad. And if there's any thoughts or comments about that decision and the process.
It's sad. It is very, very sad. I actually, our family is doing something very similar, but everyone's quarantined and we're getting tested before we go. And it's only 2 other people outside my household, and it still feels scary. And in a secluded mountain cabin. I think, I guess, Angelique, I don't know if you want to speak to sort of the scientific sort of, or the risk of the wider extended family. But that it would be a very hard decision to decide to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Ironically, I also have a family in San Diego who has a pod in San Diego, a group of extended family of about 4 households that regularly socialize together. And my perception is that not every member of that pod is quite social isolating to the extent that I'm comfortable with. So even if one party of that pod were to isolate, to social isolate to my standards, they would have to cut off their extended pod for 14 days before my family can hang out with them. And this means cutting my children off from their only cousins who are in Southern California. It's a very hard decision for me, but I definitely agree, David, if you and your wife are at high risk, it's very difficult to expect or to get other family members to quarantine to a level of safety that you might be comfortable with, and especially if it then cuts them off from their local social support network, which is what it would do for my family. Is I could say, if everyone would just stay home for 14 days, then we could have a cousin trip, and that would be great. But that means no grandparents are supplying childcare, and there's no Friday dinners. I mean, they're doing a lot together, and that's their choice, and it's really hard to balance that against my family's needs.
And yet I also think we can ask, I would like to see you, but here's what we would need. We would need 2 weeks quarantine and a COVID test before we would feel like it's safe and responsible. And all people can do is say no, which is painful.
Yeah.
But
make sure the COVID test happens by day 5, because it's been taking about 10 days to result it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, goodness. This has been so immensely helpful. And Angelique and Helen, you can see there's some comments in the chat box. And if any of you want to add to the chat box, feel free. But I think that this was really helpful for all of us to have these tools, that we just didn't have these tools yet. And for us to be able to process our feelings, because obviously you can hear there's a lot of feelings around this and the difficult decisions being made right now as we continue to surge in California. So this will be posted on YouTube probably by tomorrow. I'm going to be sharing this with people because I know how helpful it was for me. So let's just thank Angelique and Helen again through some virtual applause. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you.